Have you ever noticed how often the most intelligent, the most sensitive, those who see the world with the clearest eyes, also seem to be the loneliest? It's as if there's an invisible paradox in the human condition. The deeper the mind, the more distant it tends to be from the crowd. Carl Jung, one of the greatest explorers of the human soul, once said, "Loneliness does not come from having no people around, but from being unable to communicate what is truly important to us." Think about that. It's not the absence of company that weighs on us, but the fact that almost no one can truly hear or understand the pulse of what lies within. And this is where social life becomes a dilemma. Modern society does not value silence, introspection, or depth. On the contrary, we are constantly encouraged to be present, connected, visible. The ideal of the extrovert, communicative, energetic, surrounded by friends, has become the standard of success. But what about those who don't fit that mold? The most intelligent, the most lucid, those who perceive cracks where others see only surfaces, carry a quiet burden. For them, social gatherings often feel like theater, where everyone wears a mask to be accepted. And in the midst of this performance, they choose to step back. Not out of arrogance but out of honesty. Not out of disdain but out of necessity. Perhaps you've felt it yourself, being in a group, laughing, talking, exchanging words, but inside feeling distant as if you are an observer rather than a participant. This disconnect between a mind that seeks depth and a society that demands superficiality can be suffocating. Of course, not all isolation is healthy. Total withdrawal can become a prison. But for Jung, there are moments when stepping back is essential. He believed that individuation, the process of becoming who we truly are, is only possible when we learn to turn inward, even if it means distancing ourselves from the noise of social life. And here arises an uncomfortable yet necessary question. Could intelligence, rather than being an absolute gift, also be a kind of silent curse? Because seeing too much, understanding too much, feeling too much, can drive us away from others. But then, if this distancing is inevitable for some, what does it really mean? Is it a choice? An escape? A psychological necessity? In this video, we will explore this paradox through the lens of Carl Jung. We'll understand why the most intelligent, or perhaps the most sensitive and self-aware, tend to step away from social life. We'll talk about introversion, the burden of lucidity, creative solitude, but also the dangers of isolation. And in the end, you might realize that this tendency towards solitude is not a flaw, but a path. That it may not be a sign of weakness or inadequacy, but the mark of a deeper internal process, something few dare to traverse. But be careful, just as solitude holds secrets, it can also consume us. And the line between these two experiences is thinner than we imagine. After all, why do the most intelligent withdraw from social life? That's what we're about to uncover. Carl Jung had an uncommon talent, seeing invisible patterns in the human soul. While psychology in his time was still in its infancy, Jung dared to propose that our way of being in the world followed two primary movements: outward, toward the external world, or inward, diving into our own inner life. He called these poles extraversion and introversion. But take note, Jung never saw these categories as fixed labels or rigid boxes. He understood that every human being carries both tendencies, just in different proportions. The extrovert draws energy from interaction, contact, and external dynamism. The introvert, on the other hand, is nourished by withdrawal, contemplation, and the inner world. So far it seems simple, but the complexity emerges when we consider the culture we live in. The modern world, shaped by market economies, performance metrics, and constant digital connectivity, has become fertile ground for extroverts. Sociability is treated as a universal virtue. Networking, charisma, constant visibility, they are the currency that opens doors. Introversion, by contrast, is often misunderstood, seen as shyness, antisocial behavior, or even fragility. Think about how schools and workplaces operate. Almost everything is structured around groups. Brainstorming sessions, meetings, public presentations. The quiet child is labeled closed off. The introspective employee is often seen as unengaged. In many ways, the world has been designed for the talkers, not the silent thinkers. And this is where intelligence encounters its dilemma. For many who carry deeper minds, introversion is not a flaw to be corrected. It is a way of being. These individuals do not avoid the world out of fear, they step back out of lucidity. They recognize that constant social noise drains vital energy, and that some truths can only be discovered in silence. Jung often compared introversion and extraversion to two distinct paths of consciousness. One is like a rushing river, loud, fast, visible to all. The other is like a deep lake, still, quiet, seemingly static at first glance, yet holding hidden treasures beneath the surface. Modern society celebrates the river, movement, speed, visibility. Few, however, are willing to dive into the lake. Perhaps you've felt this contrast yourself. At a party, surrounded by quick conversations and boisterous laughter, you realize you are physically present but mentally distant. While everyone else moves like waves across the surface, your mind plunges into silent questions. What does all this mean? Why are we here? What truly are we sharing? This is the dilemma of the intelligent introvert. It's not that they disdain social interactions, but that too often they feel shallow compared to their thirst for depth. It's like offering salt water to someone who is thirsty. It quenches for a moment, but it doesn't nourish. And there's an even more unsettling detail. Modern culture confuses noise with life. The busier, more connected, more exposed someone is, the more real they seem. Silence is treated as absence, almost as a flaw. But Jung saw precisely the opposite. Withdrawal is the space where the psyche reorganizes, where the unconscious speaks, where the soul breathes. Here lies the paradox. The most intelligent often do not flee social life out of incapacity, but out of excess perception. They see the theater of masks, feel the artificiality of social roles, notice the small vanities hidden beneath banal conversations. And upon noticing this, they feel compelled to step back. But if this is true, an even more provocative question arises. Is what we call social life truly life? Or is it merely a collective performance, a way to escape ourselves? There is a kind of fatigue that does not come from the body, but from the mind. It is not physical tiredness, but exhaustion from seeing too much. The most intelligent, or perhaps the most sensitive, carry this silent burden, the inability to switch off perception. They observe details others ignore, perceive hidden contradictions, detect the fragility beneath social masks. Schopenhauer said, "The clarity of the mind increases the pain of existence." The more lucid the gaze, the more the absurdity of the world becomes evident. Nietzsche, in a different tone, stated, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." But before finding this why, the thinker is forced to confront the void, the disorder, and the weight of consciousness. Imagine being in a room full of people. Everyone seems absorbed in conversation, in the small everyday dramas and quick jokes. But within the mind of the lucid observer, questions arise that no one there dares to ask. What is the meaning of all this? Are we just repeating patterns, pretending closeness, avoiding silence? For many, this perspective is unsettling, almost intolerable. Intelligence, when paired with sensitivity, becomes like a lens that magnifies the cracks in reality. While most people can live supported by distractions, the thinker perceives the fragility of everything. The weakness of relationships, the superficiality of interactions, the fleeting nature of accomplishments. This vision is not a choice, it is destiny. An awakened mind cannot simply fall asleep again. Jung spoke of the collective unconscious as a deep ocean whose waves touch each of us. The most conscious, however, do not linger at the surface, they dive. And in that dive, they encounter truths that are not always easy to bear. They discover that much of what we call social life is actually a repetition of archetypes, inherited performances, empty rituals. This is why the most intelligent often step back. Not because they hate people, but because they can no longer fool themselves with the same distractions. Being among crowds can be lonelier for them, lonelier than being alone. Here emerges a painful paradox. The clearer the perception, the harder it becomes to coexist. The lucid mind sees the selfishness hidden in kind gestures, the vanity behind generosity, the fear disguised as courage. It's not that beauty is absent in the world, it exists profoundly. But alongside beauty, the awakened mind also perceives the shadow. And the shadow, as Jung reminded us, is inevitable. It is part of us, part of humanity, part of social life. To pretend it doesn't exist is to live a lie. And perhaps it is precisely this refusal to pretend that drives the most intelligent to step back. But this distancing comes at a price. For while intelligence shields against illusions, it also isolates. The thinker becomes a stranger in their own community, alien even among friends, out of place even within family. They see what others do not, and this creates a loneliness that is hard to share. And here we must be honest, lucidity can be unbearable. Camus wrote that, "There is no fate that cannot be overcome with contempt. But before contempt comes the weight. Before revolt comes the heavy silence of one who feels too much." So perhaps the greater question is not just why the most intelligent flee social life, but how they learn to bear the burden of seeing too much. Because if deep vision separates them, it is also this very vision that can guide them towards something greater. Meaning, creation, transcendence. But to reach that, one must first endure the pain of seeing the world without veils. And this brings us to a new question. Is this withdrawal from social life an escape, or a necessary part of a deeper path, the one Jung called individuation? Carl Jung believed that the ultimate aim of psychic life is not merely to adapt to the external world, but to find the way back to oneself. He called this process individuation, the movement toward wholeness, in which the individual becomes who they truly are, integrating both their light and their shadows. But there is a crucial detail. Individuation does not occur amid noise. It demands silence, solitude, distance. It is a path that cannot be walked on the surface of social interactions, because it depends on something far more intimate, the encounter with oneself. In the logic of social life, we are constantly shaped to adapt. We follow patterns, repeat behaviors, take on roles. Society needs this to function, but the process comes at a cost. Authenticity is slowly sacrificed in the name of acceptance. A person becomes what others expect them to be, not what their soul asks them to be. It is at this point that many of the most intelligent, or most awakened, feel the need to step back. Because they perceive that living solely according to external demands is a betrayal of one's own essence. Withdrawal, then, is not escape, it is resistance. Not weakness, it is an act of quiet courage. Jung used a powerful metaphor: he who looks outside dreams, he who looks inside awakens. But looking inward hurts. Because in doing so, we are forced to confront what we have avoided for years: our fears, our contradictions, our masks. Individuation demands this confrontation. And to navigate it, distance from social noise is often necessary. Think about what happens today with social media. It has become a showcase where everyone displays an edited version of themselves, carefully crafted to please, to be accepted, to earn approval. In this digital theater, authenticity is constantly sacrificed in exchange for likes and recognition. The problem is that the more we feed our public persona, the further we drift from our inner reality. The process of individuation, on the other hand, calls for the opposite: a withdrawal from this persona so that we can hear the self, the deeper, truer aspect of who we are. It's no wonder, then, that many of the most intelligent prefer silence to the noise of superficial interactions. They sense that, in order to become whole, they must step back. But this withdrawal is not comfortable. It is lonely, challenging, even frightening. Jung knew this. He himself retreated to Balingen on the shores of Lake Zurich, where he built a tower to reflect, write, and dive into his own psyche. There, removed from society, he found the strength to decipher the symbols, dreams, and mysteries that fueled his work. In this sense, solitude is not a punishment but a sacred space. It is there that the individual confronts their deepest layers, acknowledges their shadows, and discovers new possibilities of existence. And perhaps this is precisely why so many of the most intelligent withdraw from social life. Not because they have nothing to offer, but because they first need to traverse this inner territory. Of course, this path carries risks. Total isolation can become a prison. But without some distance, individuation is impossible. Without moments of silence and introspection, we remain trapped by external expectations, living lives that are not truly our own. This is why withdrawal is, paradoxically, an active approach. An approach toward oneself, toward meaning, toward truth. What appears as escape is, in reality, a quest. What appears as refusal of the world is often the beginning of a deeper reunion with it. And here arises a crucial question. If stepping back from social noise is necessary to become who we truly are, how do we balance this movement without falling into the prison of total isolation? There is a kind of silence that is not empty but fertile. A silence in which the mind does not get lost but finds itself. This is the territory of creative solitude, the space where intelligence not only takes refuge from the world, but flourishes in a way that would never be possible amid social noise. Carl Jung spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's ability to integrate opposing tensions, conscious and unconscious, reason and emotion, light and shadow, creating something entirely new, a synthesis that did not exist before. This function does not emerge amidst an overload of stimuli, but in withdrawal. It is in stillness that the mind can hear the subtle voices of the unconscious, translating them into symbols, ideas, creations. Nietzsche sought this silence in Sils Maria, among the mountains, walking alone and letting thoughts transform into philosophy. Einstein, often described as distracted and solitary, nurtured his discoveries in long periods of isolation, scribbling equations while the world around him seemed distant. Virginia Woolf wrote about the need for a room of one's own. Not merely a physical space but a psychic one, where the mind could expand free from external pressures. Creative solitude is not escape. It is a mental womb, a space of gestation where new forms of thought are cultivated. The modern world, however, struggles to understand this. It confuses being alone with being empty, withdrawal with weakness. But for the most intelligent, solitude is precisely the opposite. It is source, it is energy, it is root. Perhaps you've experienced a moment like this. A night when, instead of seeking distractions, you remained in silence. And from that silence arose an idea, a clarity, a creative impulse that would never have emerged amid external voices. It's as if the inner world, finally freed from the bombardment of stimuli, reveals its hidden treasures. Jung believed that the symbols that emerge from dreams, imagination, and solitude carry the power to transform life. They are not mere fantasies, but messages from the collective unconscious, fragments of humanity that pass through the individual and connect them to something greater. This is why creative solitude is not only personal, it is also universal. What is born in the solitary mind can resonate in the collective heart. And there is something deeply paradoxical here. For while solitude distances the individual from immediate social interaction, it simultaneously connects them to the broader human experience. Great ideas, works of art, scientific discoveries, almost always emerged from someone who, for a time, needed to be alone. Distance from others allowed an encounter with something larger than the ego, the archetype, the myth, the vision. Yet there is a delicate tension. Creative solitude requires discipline. It can easily slip into barren loneliness, where the individual gets lost in rumination, distancing themselves not only from others but from themselves. The secret lies in transforming solitude into creation, using it as a bridge to something beyond mere silence. Jung saw creation as part of the process of individuation. By giving form to what they find in their psyche, the individual not only comes to know themselves but also returns something to the world. Solitude, in this sense, is not the end of the path but a means. It is here that the self speaks, but the response must take shape, whether in words, images, music, or discoveries. Intelligence flourishes in solitude because, at last, it can breathe. It can stop reacting to the constant external stimuli and dive into its own rhythm. And in this dive, it discovers that emptiness is not a threat, but a possibility. And here, perhaps, comes a provocation. If solitude is the cradle of creativity and authenticity, might our modern fear of being alone be condemning us to permanent shallowness? Solitude can be fertile, but it can also be devastating. There is a fine line between withdrawal that nourishes the mind and isolation that consumes it. Carl Jung understood this. He spoke of the importance of balancing the inner and outer worlds, because the psyche cannot survive on one side alone. Just as the body needs air, the soul needs contact. The danger begins when the pursuit of individuation turns into permanent escape. When introspection ceases to be a path and becomes an absolute refuge. At this point, the individual no longer dives to know themselves, they hide in the depths of their own being. This is when solitude stops being creative and becomes a prison. Jung described the shadow as the collection of repressed aspects of the psyche, everything we avoid recognizing within ourselves. By isolating too much, the individual risks projecting this shadow outward, seeing only hostility, falsehood, or threat in the world. Prolonged isolation can feed paranoia, resentment, and distrust. What was once clarity becomes distortion. It is a cruel paradox. The same mind that withdraws to preserve its integrity can end up corroding from within. Excessive introspection breeds rumination, thoughts that repeat like an endless echo. What was analysis turns into obsession. What was contemplation turns into paralysis. Nietzsche warned, "He who fights with monsters should be careful lest he thereby become a monster." And if you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you. That abyss can be internal. To look too deeply within, without any anchor in the external world, can lead to vertigo. In modern life, this risk intensifies. Many isolate themselves not only physically but digitally. They trade human contact for superficial interactions on social media, believing they are protecting themselves from the world. But in reality, they are merely diving into ever-narrowing bubbles, where their own ideas echo without contrast, without challenge, without life. Jung argued that individuation is not a process of eternal isolation, but of integration. The initial withdrawal is necessary for self-knowledge, but the return to the world is inevitable. He believed that each person has a symbolic role to fulfill within the collective. Without this exchange, the inner journey loses its meaning. Total isolation, then, is a kind of silent betrayal. Betrayal of one's own psyche, which needs dialogue. Betrayal of the community, which needs the contribution of each authentic individual. Solitude is the forge, but once the metal is shaped, it must return to the world to fulfill its purpose. And here lies the contradiction. The most intelligent, who often withdraw from social life to preserve their depth, run the very risk of being lost in that withdrawal. If they do not return, if they do not find balance, lucidity can turn to bitterness, perception to cynicism, independence to absolute isolation. This forces us to confront a troubling question. How can we know if we are stepping back to find ourselves, or isolating to lose ourselves? The human being lives an insoluble dilemma. We need others, yet we also need ourselves. We are creatures of bonds and, at the same time, of boundaries. We seek to be understood, yet fear being dissolved in the collective. We crave company, yet find clarity only in silence. It is in this friction that the paradoxical condition of existence is drawn. Carl Jung saw this tension as an inevitable part of the journey. Individuation does not eliminate the need for contact, just as social life does not negate the longing for solitude. The paradox is not to be solved but lived. We are creatures who rise along the razor's edge between the I and the we. Modern life tries to anesthetize this conflict. It pushes us to extremes, either hyper-collectivism, where identity dissolves into mass patterns, or hyper-individualism, where each person retreats into their own bubble, proclaiming absolute independence. Both paths are illusions. Humans need more nuance, more balance, more accepted contradiction. The most intelligent, or the most sensitive as Jung preferred, feel this contradiction more intensely. That is why they step back, why they hesitate. It is not arrogance or misanthropy. It is the acute awareness that every true connection requires vulnerability, and that every vulnerability carries the risk of being wounded. They protect themselves, yet they also yearn. They reject the noise, yet they desire the echo of presence. It is in this paradoxical space that life gains depth. Solitude gives richness, but only encounter gives meaning. Silence reveals, but only dialogue confirms. The inner dive generates lucidity, but only the sharing of that lucidity transforms it into living wisdom. Thus, withdrawal from social life should not be confused with absolute rejection of humanity. It is often a necessary pause, a breath of the soul. But after the solitary inhalation comes the exhalation that meets the other. Just as the lungs cannot only inhale without ever releasing air, the psyche cannot only withdraw without ever opening. This is the human condition, to live in tension, to love solitude and fear it, to love closeness and suffocate in it, to seek the other without losing oneself. It is a game without a solution, yet it is precisely here that the beauty of existence resides. Nietzsche said, "He who has a why to live can bear almost any how." Perhaps the why of our solitude is this: it prepares us for encounter. And perhaps the why of our social life is this: it returns us to the world after we have found ourselves. What is unbearable is not the contradiction, it is the attempt to deny it. Why do the most intelligent flee social life? Because they feel too much. Because they think too much. Because they perceive that every human encounter is imperfect, and that every silence is necessary. But also because, deep down, they know that escape is never final. Sooner or later, the return becomes inevitable. The paradox is this: we flee because we must, but we return because we cannot live without. And perhaps true wisdom is not in choosing one or the other, but in learning to dance between them, between the silence of solitude and the voice of the community, between the abyss of the self and the bridge to the other. In the end, we are neither fully social nor fully solitary. We are paradoxical beings. Beings who are found precisely in the oscillation between being with the world and being with ourselves. And perhaps this is what Jung was trying to tell us. Life is not to be solved. It is to be endured, integrated, lived. If this video touched you in some way, subscribe to the channel and continue exploring the paradoxes that make us human.